Hello,
And welcome to the Career Coven. I'm Beck,
and I'm Annie.
and this is our last episode of season one. I can't believe we're here, Annie. What
I
what
know.
what a dream it's been.
What a
Um,
joy it has been, indeed. We have traversed the conversational landscape of professional development, and we have landed at feedback as the last episode.
we'd go out with a bang on one that I think I've got quite mixed feelings about feedback, but I know you're quite passionate about feedback.
Yeah, I've got very strong positive feelings towards it. I just think that, what are we all here for if not to learn? And feedback is just such an important way to do that. You just never know how other people perceive what you do, what you say. Even if you intend it one way, it can be perceived very differently. And you just never know until people tell you. And I think the reason I like it so much is because I think it's so pointless, sitting there obsessing over what other people think of you and did that go well when someone could just tell you. Um, it just saves everyone so much time. Uh, so yeah, I think everyone deserves an opportunity to grow, and that's why I feel so passionate about feedback. And don't get me wrong, it's not always a nice experience. It doesn't. The fact that I think it's useful and has high value doesn't mean that it's always enjoyable. Absolutely not. But yeah, I'm pretty into it. I'm pretty pro it in the workplace. I think it's very needed.
I mean, I'm like logically and theoretically into it, and then in practice, I feel incredibly awkward about it. Like I have a bit of a knot in my stomach, even just talking about it now.
Is that because you don't like confrontation?
Maybe, or I mean, but I don't even mind confrontation really. I wouldn't say I'm on an avoidance scale at all.
No.
Um, uh, but it's more just I don't know. I sort of immediately feel a bit self-conscious. I feel awkward for
Mm,
the other person. I obviously logically think feedback is excellent and there are lots of benefits to it, but maybe it's just because I felt uncomfortable every time I receive feedback. And like, to be fair, most of the feedback is really nice, so I shouldn't feel like that. But just mentally preparing for someone to be outing me is,
mm,
awful or hated or whatever. Maybe a bit of imposter syndrome. I don't know.
mm. Well, I don't think we're as a culture particularly good at being honest with each other. Like we're not really raised in a way where direct feedback is good. I think girls are sort of particularly told to be quiet and be good and not necessarily share what they're always thinking. So I'm sure that there are reasons that you might feel this quite inherent sense of ick about feedback generally. And I think most people feel that way. I just love it.
I'm really happy for you. I'll be here representing the general population who feel really awkward about it. I was about to say maybe I feel like quite British about it, but I don't really fully identify as British.
Well, that's what I was thinking as I said it. I was like, you didn't grow up here, so this doesn't count. But, you know, that's why I should feel awkward about it. And I definitely used to. I think I've just been given some really good advice on how to depersonalize feedback over my years of employment. That has really helped me actually do that, hopefully, and therefore made it just a lot less scary. But before I got that advice and before I got those tools and stuff, I also felt the same.
Mm.
For sure. I was very scared of feedback. I didn't want to have these conversations. I found them very difficult, very uncomfortable when I did have them. Um, so yeah, it's evolved over time for me.
Well, me and the general population look forward to learning how to not be awkward about it from you. I think the feedback that I've received that's been really good has always been maybe it doesn't feel like it's good at the time. It actually Um, sometimes, actually, the most uncomfortable feedback I've had, where I was really pissed off about it, actually was incredible feedback. But it took me
Mm,
ages to recognize it was great feedback. But I think it does create an opportunity for you to grow and reflect and just close the delta between how you think about yourself and how others perceive you. otherwise, I suppose you probably wouldn't really know what you would need to be focusing on to kind of learn and grow
Yeah,
without it. You could have a guess, but you might be right.
exactly. And yeah, a lot of the best feedback I've ever received, I instantly disagree with it, which means that it's probably like interestingly triggered something in me where I'm like, nope, that's not it. They've got that wrong. And then like 2 weeks later, I'm like, they're totally right. That is exactly it. And that's why I thought they were wrong. So it definitely, even though I find it very useful for the reasons you said, which is like, how else will your development areas? Um, it doesn't mean that every time I get it, I'm like, oh, thank you. Thank you. I agree. Sometimes I'm like, okay, interesting observation.
Good. Okay, tell me about like the best time that you've had feedback. Like what made it really good?
So recently, my team, like in the current role, the end of the year, gave me some 360 feedback. That was really useful because they all obviously had put the time into telling me like what I needed to work on, and I'd only been there a few months and had been in a leadership role, and it can be quite hard to get feedback when you're in a leadership role. So that was really useful because it was very structured. I'd given them all some examples on how to do it, and then I got the opportunity to talk to them about it. So I like a 360 because I think it's good to have different perspectives. And then I would also say that my last line manager gave me some incredibly good feedback after we've been working together for about 6 months. She put loads of time into it. And what I particularly liked is that she wrote it down for
Mm.
me. So I had a record of it. And I, in general, as a person, like to write things down to process them. But very few people who have given me like a verbal kind of probation review feedback have like made so much effort to write it out and give examples. And she did that. And I was really grateful for that. And there were parts in it that I didn't agree with, but those were probably the most useful parts.
I mean, it's really fascinating, I think, writing it down because every time I've received feedback and you go away and you come back an hour later and basically the only thing you can remember is like the one thing that really fucked you off, even if the 99% of the conversation was really nice. So it is good to have that written down as a kind of objective record of what they said rather
Yeah.
than how you remembered it.
And I write down all of my feedback. I write it down before I give it into this like structure, behavior, impact, feelings, future. I'm sure we will talk about it because it's my thing that I do. But I would never I wouldn't really give much feedback that was long without putting it into this structure because I think it helps depersonalize it. I am happy to give some feedback off the cuff, but I would say I have a kind of strong positive bias for that. So it's like, oh, if you ask me for a quick bit of feedback, I'd probably be like, yeah, it was good. It's good back. Yeah, it was all right. Whereas if I've had time to think about it, I'd be like, well, possibly, wasn't that good. But yeah, so I write everything down and I find that really useful. It makes me more careful with what I then actually say in the meeting, the words I use.
Mm.
And I think that's really important for when you give feedback is that you have thought through the exact words you say for literally the reason you just said, which you can say one phrase for a whole good hour and they might only hear that phrase if that phrase was slightly wrong, which obviously makes it sound like I'm putting, a lot of pressure on people giving feedback, but like, one sort of sloppy moment can ruin like a really, really great conversation. So I do prepare a lot for feedback conversations. Yeah.
Yeah, I think like off the cuff remarks, as the speaker, you feel like they're just sort of filler words, but as the recipient can be sort of disproportionately damaging, especially when they're made in a not thoughtful way. I think also, I mean, one of the best line managers I've worked with, she was a former BCG consultant, and when I started working with her, she used to red pen every single bit of my work in like a really intense way that when I
Mm.
started working with her, I was like, oh my God, everything is wrong. But actually, that sort of process for me became insanely beneficial in making me genuinely quite militant in like all of the bits of work that I put together. And I'm really grateful for that. And I think I've taken that into my leadership in saying it's not about you and it's about making the work better. And this will feel painful, but don't take it personally. Should we talk about bad feedback examples?
Yeah, I mean, I think bad feedback is vague. It's like very open to interpretation. Just like, oh, well, I think you did this and that was people thought that was this. You make it about other people, not yourself, because you're not brave enough to actually give the direct feedback. And then when you ask for an example, like, can you give me an example of a time when I have actually done that? They can't give you an example and they say something like, you do it all the time. You do it all the time. That's why we're having this conversation. And I'm like, well, if I do it all the time, tell me just one time that I've actually done it. And then that's fine. But yeah, I think vague, I think blaming, like making it sound like it's collective feedback when actually it's very individual feedback. I think that's sloppy. I think it's lazy. I think it's conflict averse. And then yeah, no examples really grinds my goat. You know, if it's a proper feedback chat and you're coming to it and you actually can't think of an example, then it's like that to me is what are we talking about?
Yeah, I mean, it's super interesting. What do you make of collective feedback? Because I was just thinking, we've just had our performance reviews for the year, and generally you'll get a bit of feedback. It will be sent to your line manager, and they will sort of present it in totality. And I'm interested to hear your views on the anonymity of feedback and whether that is or isn't helpful. I feel quite strongly that there are really valid reasons why you would make it anonymous to the person who's receiving it, but not to the line manager. But what do you think?
Yeah, so I would say I definitely think where there are real power structures at play, that can really penalize certain people. I think having anonymous feedback is fine. Like is good. You know, in many kind of startups, they have like tools where you can post feedback that goes straight to the C-suite, straight to the CEO, but it's all anonymized. And I think that is really good because I think it can be very hard to speak up about what you think is actually going on in your workplace to the person who ultimately pays you. And but there might be some stuff going on that they're not aware of. And I think that being anonymous is totally fine. What I don't like love is kind of peer level anonymity. You know, if someone at my level cannot take me aside and speak to me about a perceived behavior that maybe they've heard about from their team, like, or maybe they just seen it in a meeting and they're my peer, that to me would speak to that relationship not being great. I would want someone at a peer level to me to definitely be able to give me direct feedback. And then obviously, you know, yeah, I think kind of downwards to me, I would probably hope that that would also not be anonymous. But I think there are really, really valid reasons for anonymous feedback, and I think anonymous feedback can be very, very useful, especially at scale.
Yeah, I mean,
What do you
I
think?
would love to see like the range of comments in an anonymous feedback to a C-suite. I suppose in a startup, it might be a little bit less Wild West because there are fewer people to fill it in. But I can imagine if there was like that version at the organization that I work at, it would probably be like kind of insane. But
I think in most places it is quite insane. Just to be clear, I think in most places it's mad, and some of it's, you know, within it is like nuggets of gold. Within it's things are probably to be really concerned about, and there's lots of just like nothingness. But yeah, I think it is quite mad everywhere.
yeah, I think also, I like what you said about the peer feedback. I also feel like if you genuinely have feedback that you want to give someone who's, you know, not more senior to you, unless like their line manager has approached you already, I think it is better for your relationship to do it directly rather than like copying in their line manager or going to their line manager, because I think there's no reason for there to be that sort of punitive element to receiving it. I would maybe think about it if I gave them the feedback and they didn't do anything about it. But in the first
Yeah,
instance, that feels like the most respectful thing to do.
definitely. I think that's a really good point. I hadn't thought of it that way, but it can absolutely feel more serious if it's kind of gone to your line manager and then come back down to you rather than just going direct across
Yeah.
to each other.
I think also, like, I find it really frustrating in a feedback conversation where I'm receiving the feedback when people just say, it's really good. I have no specific feedback. I find that almost more annoying than actually having an actionable thing to grow on. It sort of leaves you like, oh, I guess that's fine, but it doesn't feel like amazing. It's like that feels sufficient, and perhaps a little bit lazy. Um,
Yeah. You're type A, so you wouldn't like that. But like I do, I would say usually when someone says that to me, I also think, oh, that's a bit lazy. You know, even if you did think it was all really good, you could have said specifically, I liked this bit. That makes a difference. Giving me the specific, as aforementioned example, makes a very big difference in like the credibility of the feedback to me. Um, including when it is just like that was amazing, like couldn't have done it better myself, specifically liked XYZ. Oh, thank you, thank you, yes, I will take all of that. Oh, it's a great, I don't have any feedback, lazy, lazy. That's a
Okay,
no.
so tip number one for giving feedback is don't be lazy. And the other one before we move on
Don't be
to a more
lazy.
constructive part of the conversation, one thing that I used to really get bothered about was when someone more senior to me would just say like, this isn't right, or they would just redo the work themselves, and it's like so incredibly frustrating because you never find out how you could improve, and it actually becomes just really demoralizing because you're like, well, I'm just going to try something else and see if that works. But um, that's another example where like absence of feedback is unbelievably painful.
Yeah, that's one of my development areas actually. I tend to do like I tend like once I've given the feedback and then I'll be like I just want it to be done like this, but I've actually sort of done it then. And in this useful 360 feedback that I got from the team, that was one of the things that they pulled out as they were like, you've got to kind of give us a chance to like you don't have to do as much. We should probably be doing a bit more. So that we can learn how to do stuff without you just kind of having done it and telling us how to do it so that we can do it next time.
I think there's a very big difference in
Yeah.
there around urgency. So, like, sometimes you don't have time to go through, as a leader, the kind of extensive feedback round. But when I have done this previously, I've always been like, after the fact, here are the things that I changed and how I changed them to improve them. So, like, you can do it next time, but I just did it. But I'm trying not to do that. So,
Yeah.
tell us about your feedback model, Annie. What does great feedback look like? Give us the rundown.
Yeah. So I'm going to take like literally zero credit for this because um, our very good team at Thriver got us some external feedback training when we were very early on in being line managers. And it was great. And it was by someone I know's wife who works in HR. And so she deserves like full credit for pulling this together. And it has had a really big impact on me. But she said that like every bit of feedback that you ever want to give can be kind of constructed in a way where there is the behavior, and this behavior is something that irrefutably happened. So it might be like, I took your pen, and you can agree with the person at the start. So I can agree with you. I just took your pen. And you can say, yeah, we agree. You took my pen. But then the rest of the dimensions are not an irrefutable fact. So they are about how other people interpret it. So the second one after behavior is impact, which is like, what was the impact of you taking that pen? So you could say to me, the impact of you taking my pen, Annie, was that I can't write, can't take my notes for this call. And then the next one is feelings. How did that make you feel? And you could say, well, I was frustrated because I had literally just jumped onto a call that I needed to take notes for, and I couldn't because I didn't have a pen. So I was pretty frustrated, and yeah, I was a bit irritated by it. And then future, which is the last F, is like, how would you like that to be next time the situation comes up? And you could say, yeah, next time, just tell me that you've taken my pen so I can take notes on my phone, or just don't take my pen. And the way that I think writing things out like this, what I think it does is no one can really argue with like how it makes you feel, because like that is your own thing. So if you were annoyed at me, like really annoyed at me for the pen, I can't say, no, you weren't annoyed. Come on. Because that's yours, it's your emotion. So it's like, it's much easier to kind of have a conversation where effectively you're telling me I really annoyed you, but it just sounds different than you really annoyed me if you say like, the way that actually made me feel that I couldn't take notes on my call was really frustrating. I was really frustrated with you. That's pretty reasonable. Like that's a pretty reasonable thing to say. And it just kind of depersonalizes the whole thing. And I just find it incredibly helpful, especially in difficult situations where you really disagree, because you have to have a conversation about the behavior. So you have to agree. Because I might have said, you said, oh, you took my pen. I might say, I didn't take your pen. It's my pen.
Mm.
You can say, well, this is why I think it was my pen. And then I might go, oh God, wait a second. That pen is actually your pen. I thought I took my pen. Sorry. And then you've like cleared it up, right? But if it's something much more serious, which is like, that was within my sphere of influence, and you like, do you agree that I own X decision? The answer is usually, in most organizations, it is clear who owns ultimately a decision. Sometimes it can be very hard, but usually it is. And you have to have that initial conversation of, yes, Beck, actually, I agree. That is your decision to own. And then you're starting from this level of like, okay, so we've agreed X happened. There is a point of agreement. And then you talk about all this other stuff. And yeah, honestly, I feel like it's like magic. Every time I've used it, it's really helped. Every time people have done it to me, it has really helped me not feel shit about what they're saying. It doesn't feel as personal. And yeah, I just think it's a really good discipline to think that carefully about what you're about to say in these types of structured feedback conversations. There are other ones, like there's one called like situation impact. It's like SBIR or something. I'll put it in the show notes. So it's not the only one which exists, but yeah, I find this stuff really, really useful so that feedback doesn't lead to just like an emotional communication breakdown, which is what I think can happen when feedback's not well thought through.
Like super interesting. I'm just trying to think about like how I would apply this model to something slightly more high stakes than the pen. So the behavior
Yeah.
is, we agreed that I would hand over a piece of work to you, and there are lots of dependencies on you completing the work, and it's taken you more than a year to do the work, and I'm fucked off about it.
Okay, so what I would, the side note I would caution is like, I would hope that this isn't the first time we're giving the feedback if we're a year in
Yeah,
to a late deliverable.
I've given them feedback.
So maybe the behavior is actually, we've had a discussion before about this deliverable that I gave you, and I still haven't got the deliverable. Is that true? Do you agree that's true? And I would say, I'm your person. Yeah, okay. Yes, I agree. You did give me this deliverable a year ago, and I can also confirm that I have not done that. Then I think you would say the impact on this is that X business outcome. This problem has not been solved, and we have lost this amount of money. The impact ideally should be like customer, commercial.
Yeah.
It should be like not like I went home and cried to my husband. You can give that feedback, but it's just different. And then you would say the feeling is I feel incredibly frustrated about this. because this is the third time we're having this conversation. I feel like I'm wasting my time having this conversation with you. It's leading to more frustration. And in future, I'd like to not have to have multiple conversations with you to ask for a deliverable that I have given you with a clear time date. Is that reasonable? And they would say, yeah, probably, because it probably is reasonable. Or they might say, no, I can't promise that. I'm really snowed under. Here's all of my excuses, blah, 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 blah. But then what I think is if you've got it written down, I think you can literally just say something like, I think it is reasonable that when I hand over a piece of work to you that has a deadline, you deliver it within a reasonable amount of time and I don't have to have multiple conversations with you about it. I think that is reasonable. So if we disagree on that, that's fine. But you take it back to the behavior, this like quite neutral statement, like, I think actually that is a reasonable ask of me onto you.
I love that. I think that's a really good. That to me made the penny drop slightly more than the pen, but I think it's fascinating. I think also like I would be terrified to work with you because if you could speak that clearly about giving feedback, I'd be like, yes, Annie, it's very reasonable.
What I would say, right, is like it takes a lot of time to give feedback like this. You have to really like sit down and like think about it. So I definitely don't want to pretend that like I'm doing this on a weekly basis with my whole team. Like, oh, let's have a biff session of like me giving you. I'm not like I'm definitely not the perfect person. But when it comes to like sort of quarterly feedback sessions, I will kind of try and sit down and do this really well. Um, yeah, everyone who's worked with me will have heard of that framework. They would have seen it. They would have had a little document, at least
The
one.
biff. It's got
The
to have a
biff.
better name than the biff. I mean, I the only other thing that I would add to feedback that what great feedback looks like to me, I find it best if I'm asked it in a coaching style. That really works for me in terms
Mm,
of helping me to reflect, and I can be coaxed along with if I'm not quite hitting the mark that the person who's giving feedback is um, hoping for. They can steer on beyond that, but I find that really helpful. I find that when I am running feedback sessions, like, how do you think that went, or what would you do differently, are really easy questions.
yeah, yeah. Do you think that though is because you've got to a level where you would have a good response to a question like that?
I think you have to have a lot of trust to be able to have a conversation like that. I've definitely had examples where I've tried that exercise with people who we don't have as strong a relationship, and I'll go, how do you think that went? And they will go, pretty good. And I'll be like, interesting, I had a slightly different take on it. And like that, I think it requires
Right. Yeah,
it
yeah.
requires a bit of introspection from the recipient. And I think, another good topic for us to talk about is like, when is good timing to give feedback.
Yeah, with the best will in the world, right? Even really good feedback, if someone is like not in a place where they like can receive it, I think it can still go very badly. Um, so yeah, I think you have to be careful giving feedback it when someone is like visibly very, very tense, anxious, upset. Um, I would caution that by saying I guess sometimes that is unavoidable. Like very hard conversations, people may be very upset and you may need to be giving them feedback in that. But if it's just a kind of line manager developmental chat, if you know that someone is incredibly stressed out that morning, they have arrived late, they're all over the place, they give you some cues that they're feeling really under pressure, they haven't got their work done, they feel really stressed, it may not be the time to kind of deliver a biff.
Deliver a bit.
And I think you can and I think you can ask like, do you want to have this session today? Should we reschedule? Can see that you might be a bit stressed. I also think it's good if you are in a bad mood as the person giving the feedback, when you ask that question, like, is everyone feeling like good? Should we do this? If you're honestly not feeling good, you should also have the like self, you know, reflection, self-awareness to say, I actually don't want to give you this today because I'm feeling a bit sassy, or I had a really bad tube journey, or I'm really under pressure and I'm actually thinking about this other thing.
I mean,
Yeah, I
I just
think.
also hate real time feedback, mostly because I'm like a bit of a slow processor. I definitely like need to digest stuff and like have a day or two behind me before I am able to crystallize how I think something went, unless it went catastrophic, in which case I definitely already know and don't need to hear about it at the time. But I sort of wonder, like, is there an ideal sort of like timing point around feedback? Because I think if you leave it too long, it's probably less effective, right?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think the ideal would be to have like quite regular sort of feedback chats structured into one-to-one time, or at least for me that has what has worked well. It always gets deprioritized, right? Because everything else just always gets prioritized. So if you at least have it, on your one-to-one notes, or like in the calendar, this is a feedback one-to-one, at least there are some cues to say, like, let's have these conversations regularly. But definitely for me, the reason like timeliness is important is it's linked to that example. Like if someone gives me an example of a behavior that they want me to change, and it's had this really bad feeling, it's made them feel really annoyed or whatever. One, I don't like the thought that they are annoyed with me for a month, for 6 months. But two, I also can't remember
Mm,
that example very well anymore. And sometimes maybe if it's like a big bust up, you will remember it. But a lot of times it's small stuff, right? Like a lot of the stuff that annoys people, it's not big things, it's small things that
it's
you do
definitely a
more
thousand paper
regularly.
cuts with your colleagues. Yeah.
Exactly. And so that's why I think the timeliness is so important. Because if you told me something I'd done 6 months ago to annoy you in a conversation, I might remember it. But we talk so much that I probably
Yeah.
wouldn't.
Yeah. I think also, should we?
You probably have to tell me.
I don't have any feedback for you. That's lazy girl feedback.
Not
Um,
enough.
publicly, feedback should never be given publicly if it is if it is no bueno.
That's true. That's actually very true. And I think in terms of also people feeling comfortable, I think privately and also in an environment where that person is comfortable. So, if someone does really prefer working from home, consider that before you kind of drag them in for an in-person in a coffee shop session. People probably want it to be in private, and they probably want it to be in their like preferred setting.
Yeah, definitely. Is there anything we would highlight to get you in the mindset for receiving feedback? I think for me, it's important to remember
Mm,
that you need to focus on whether you value and trust the person who's giving you feedback, and like trusting their judgment.
mm,
And if you have a relationship with them that is bigger picture positive, odds are the feedback is coming from a really good place. I think that really helps
yeah.
me.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a really good one. I think just trying to reframe it, as we said at the start, as like it is, it sounds a bit wanky, but it is a gift for someone to go out of their way and like bother to tell you the way that you might have been perceived, or something that you did. You might have annoyed more than one person. Like, you just don't know. Not everyone has perfect self awareness. So I think like trying to reframe what you're hearing as like, it's actually really useful for me to understand this. I don't think that, I don't think you have to kind of be so thankful and grateful when people are saying really hard stuff. I don't think you have to kind of like pander to the person, just be like, I'm so grateful, everything you say, it just helps me learn. Like, that's a bit disingenuous. But I think mentally preparing yourself for like the reason that we do this is we're all trying to get better. We're all trying to learn. I might hear some things I don't like. I might hear some things that I really don't agree with. You actually don't have to agree with the feedback you hear. You also don't have to action it. You just have to listen to it and kind of respect the person who's giving it to you. And I think if you go into it thinking like, all I have to do is actually listen to this, and then, as you said, loads of people take a bit of time to mull things over. You don't have to agree. You don't have to high five at the end. You don't have to hug. It doesn't have to be like super great. I think it's just trying to listen and take from it what you find useful.
Yeah, and I think also it's worth saying, if you're the recipient of some difficult feedback, it's also really difficult for the person giving you the feedback to give it to you. Like
Yeah.
I doubt even a tiny percentage of people would take any joy in that. So you know, like when I have to give hard feedback, it's something that I genuinely fret about for ages, making sure that I get it right, because it's important to get right. But it still makes you feel anxious. Well, at least it makes me feel anxious, because maybe it won't, because I have Biff now. But
no, I still feel anxious. Everyone does, right? Because it's human nature. I think that's a really good point. Trying to be empathetic towards the person giving it, especially if they know it's going to upset you, right? As you say, that's really tough. Yeah, what else? Good tips to get in the mindset. I think being able to say if you're really not is a really important one. If you can't take it, if there is something going on and it's just never going to go well for you, I think being able to say, I will have this conversation with you, I will even do it tomorrow, but seriously, if we have it today, I'm just going to lose it. That is like, great. I want to know that. I want to know that before I then lay into you about the stuff that isn't actually causing you to be overwhelmed, which is usually all the stuff outside of, this conversation. But yeah, I think if you're not okay, being able to say it is important.
I've also found with like really challenging feedback conversations, it's never usually, it ends up being just about work. If there's really extreme patterns of behavior that you're picking up and having a conversation about, the conversation very typically for me would swerve into a place of like, this person explaining what was going on in their home life or their mental health, or there's really, really tricky personal circumstances they're dealing with, and they go, I know I'm not being my best self right now, and actually having just like a human conversation with someone about that almost takes the edge and the heat out of how whatever is going on for them is manifesting at work, because you're like, I just have empathy with you about what's going on, just to let you know this is how it's playing out at work, but let's talk about how we can make that situation holistically better for everyone.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Okay, listener questions. Does feedback need to be received well to be effective?
No. I just think that's a straight no. It's much nicer for everyone involved if it is received well, as we have just mentioned. But I think often good feedback strikes a nerve because it is true. And that nerve might express itself in a way that isn't great. And I think as long as a person can come back and acknowledge that, or like mutually you can acknowledge that it like wasn't the conversation that you wanted to have, ideally you'd be able to move past it, because everyone is like fallible. No one can be like perfect. And I think it's not a natural thing to give loads of feedback. You can just hit people at a bad time, and then it can be really good. And as I say, the best feedback I've ever had, like usually the most right feedback, I know it's right because I'm like, no, I don't do that. And then in like 2 weeks, I'll be like, oh, that is actually interesting. I possibly do that a bit actually. But my instant thing was actually, I didn't say like no, but when this person was delivering it to me, I remember thinking like, you could not be more wrong. Could not be more wrong about me. That is a complete misinterpretation of me. And then literally 2 weeks later, I was like, that's definitely true.
Yeah, I feel like my least effective mode of receiving feedback is when I respond with total indifference. I'm like, yeah, whatever. Because that's more me being like, I'm never going to change. Sorry. But,
Yeah. That's just fine.
Takes the sting out. Okay, what about this one? When I receive poor feedback, my instinct is to discredit it or the feedback giver. Is all feedback good? This is quite similar to your answer that you just gave there.
Yeah, look, I think all feedback is data. Data comes with biases, right? And one of those biases might be that you don't have a good relationship with the person giving it to you, that they want the same job, you're both going for the same job, whatever. There's loads of stuff, but you don't have to action it. I would take feedback from you more seriously than I would take feedback from, Joe blogs off the street. That's because there's context. I do think that getting the data is really important, but I don't think you have to action all the data points you get.
Super interesting.
What about you?
This reminds me, I mean, we've had a conversation about this because I'm pretty sure I phoned you like in floods of tears. This was like last year when I got one scathing.
Oh yeah, that was
scathingly unprofessional bit of 360 feedback from someone who had a bit of a personal issue with me. That was, I think, both like surprising and hurtful, and that is feedback that I would happily discredit.
Agree. And I think the extremes are usually, if you get extremely negative or extremely positive feedback that is in dimensions that you have literally never got feedback in, I would be like, okay, that's interesting. But like, because it's data, I'd be like, oh, that's one data point, whereas actually all of these other things have so many more data points. It's like an outlier.
Yeah, you're really right. The strength of the data points in the patterns between them, and the consistencies. Yeah. Like every bit of feedback that I've always had has been consistently within a couple of themes, rather than anything else. I love this one. I want to help someone and feel I can give them feedback, but I'm not sure they'll want to hear it from me. What should I do?
I think you should just ask them if they want it.
Do people say no to that?
They might say no.
Do people say no? I feel like people will feel sucked into saying yes.
I think I would say no to some people. I think there are some people that if they said, do you want a bit of feedback on what I think is kind of holding you back, let's say professionally, I would be like, no, thanks.
I don't think most people would have the bollocks to do that, Annie. I'm not open to feedback. Close business. Thank you.
No, but like, I think that, look, I guess implicit in this question is that there is some sort of relationship there, right? So I would say no to a random stranger kind of offering me some feedback, or someone I really didn't know, because I just don't think you probably know enough about me, and that's fine. Let's say this person does have a useful viewpoint. I do still think you should check if they want it. And then you should ask them like how they would prefer to talk about it. Do they want to go for a coffee? If you're really giving this person sounds like they want to land some like life feedback, some like big stuff. And I think if you really want to do that, as you've said, it being a bit more conversational, it being a bit more coachy can like make it an easier conversation to get through. But I still think you should probably ask. Like I don't think I would take it that well if someone kind of said, do you want to go for a coffee? And then they sat down and they actually just feedbacked me about me without my consent. I would be like, sorry, I thought we were just gonna have a chat.
Got icky tummy again. No one wants to be bounced into like a mini character assassination over a coffee.
Yeah.
I think that was it for the listener questions. I just had one more kind of question comment. Obviously there's in feedback world radical candour, which has sort of been on the scene for a while now. Do you have any views on that?
I do have views. They might be a bit impolite. Well, some things I think inherently in that framework are good, which is like it's important to say when things are like going wrong, acting fast, not sitting on things. I do think the kernels of the theory are good. I think radical candor can be weaponized to disguise being an absolute arsehole. And I think that I think that, you know, other people talk about, like, I think maybe it's, in fairness, maybe it's even part of the same actual book, but there's like radical empathy as well, which is like really trying to understand how your words will impact someone else, and be prepared for that. I think that's like a really important part of, if you're going to be like radically candid, be like empathetic with it. Look, I probably know people that would say that they practice radical candor and it's absolutely amazing. And I think it probably is quite a simple and good world to live in. I just think that very few people are used to that level of just like constant feedback, like constant barrage. And I think that you just have to make sure that the people you bring into a truly kind of radically candid environment will suit that radically candid environment, because it's not very common. Um, but yeah, everything can be weaponized, right? Like psychological safety can be weaponized against you. Your feedback is, I'm not going to let you give me any feedback because I feel psychologically unsafe in this moment. Like, you can kind of weaponize any of these things. So I think that is one thing to be mindful of. But yeah, I think in particular, radical candor got into the zeitgeist. And I think a lot of people who were just being like really mean and really rude were like, I'm just radically candid. I'm actually just radically candid. It's like, no, you're just a radical arsehole.
Yeah, I mean, I think for radical candor to work properly, you also need like an extreme amount of EQ, and like most people I've ever worked with do not have that appropriate level of EQ to be able to have that conversation in a nice way. I think also some people feel like they're probably being radical when they're not, conversely. um
Yeah, that's true.
like especially for British people.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Yeah, I'm not sure it is actually radical, to the point you just made. I'm not actually sure it is that radical to just be candid, just be open. I think it is very, very hard because it takes people a lot of energy. As you say, you have to have high EQ, but also you have to notice what's going on. And that takes a lot of time. And when you work in organizations as large as yours, you have to notice like what's going on in so many different teams, departments, you know, that it almost becomes impossible. So yeah, I'm not sure. I certainly don't really talk about radical candor all that much, actually.
Yeah, I get asked to give feedback a lot around performance reviews, and I think that's just like the culture of a big company. But I only ever really elect to respond to those requests when I feel like I have something meaningful to say, because otherwise I don't feel qualified to comment on whether like something was particularly good or particularly bad. You're like, I'm just not close enough. And like I could tell you
Yeah.
something, but I don't have a high degree of confidence in my own assessment, so you shouldn't put any weight in my own
Yeah.
assessment.
And I think that's really good, because you never know, right? You never know how your feedback that is quite vague and maybe like you don't feel confident in can actually then spiral to be some quite big feedback if you just give it really flippantly. Especially when it's like in a 360 context where it's like, actually this VP just said they think you're X, which probably isn't what you said, but it's summarized one level. And you know, so yeah, I think it's good not to respond if you don't have enough to say. And on that note, shall we?
Shall we? It's been a pleasure. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and thank you, everyone, for making it through to the end of season 1. We have been so delighted that you have been listening to us, and so grateful to have you here. So keep your eyes and ears peeled for season 2, which we are planning in the works currently. Anything else you want to add, Annie, before we go?
No, let us know what you think. We're all ears, and give us the feedback. It helps. And that's where I'll end.
Annie being avoidant about doing intros and exits like the whole of season 1. There's some feedback for her. All right. Thanks, everyone, for listening. Please do give us lots of stars and shares, and let all of your friends know about us. And we will be back next season. Thanks so much.